Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share tools and perspectives to equip leaders in self-development and team connection. I am your host, Natasha, and I am excited to share today's episode with you. Today's episode is a conversation with Dr. Andy Hall, a professor and retired U.S. Army veteran who shares insight on building teams of diverse individuals and how to use the workspace to empower different personalities within a team. Thank you so much for joining me, Andy. I'm so excited for our conversation. Can I have you introduce yourself and tell us your style of leadership?
My name is Andy Hall, and I am an associate professor at Marymount University, teaching data science and cybersecurity. I also am an adjunct research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses, which is a federally funded research and development corporation here in the nation's capital, working on problems within the Department of Defense. And I would say that my leadership style was developed through my time in the Scouts, followed by 30 years or 30 plus years if you count the West Point time in the Army. The style develops over time, but you definitely have you start off with a hands-on leadership style, and really, I think, move towards the notion of more of a player coach over time. I had an opportunity teaching at West Point, and part of what I did when I was teaching at West Point was actually coaching crew, and I coached the women's crew at West Point, which definitely get practice at the player coach type idea, and actually not even the player, you're just the coach. But those notions of coaching come back into what you're doing. And having been in the Army as a senior officer on staffs, you get to learn quite a bit of how you have to do team building and consensus building to try to get towards what you want as the goal line. And I think that I have a leadership style that's based on trying to find consensus, but then also having experienced and doing the hands-on and then working there as a player coach.
And I can say that having experienced working with you, I definitely saw that style in our interactions and then in the interactions within the organization that we worked in. So you said you were in the Scouts and then in the military. Was there a specific event or maybe small series of events that led to you really identifying as a leader?
I think I have always worked as a leader. And I do remember back in high school, at one point, I had been the class president and was always basically in charge. And I remember Pam Iverson, and that is her maiden name, and I haven't seen her in years, but we had some project, and I think it was in geography class, and they said, somebody has to be in charge. I said, well, who wants to be in charge? And Pam said, well, you want to be in charge. And it was when I really realized that there was no doubt that there were certain of us that were always kind of at the forefront. And you kind of look back on that and the things that we were doing, be it the leadership through Scouts, the leadership that you were doing through church, or some of the informal things that happened, or the leadership through the student government, what you do with student government. I think that all of those things kind of work together towards becoming the person that you'd be. There's a lot of different ways of leading, and one of the things another leadership opportunity I remember from high school was, at the time I was probably about 6 foot 180. I was an offensive lineman in high school, so not terribly big, but big enough, and definitely bigger than any of the other people on the track team that were going to be running the 2 mile. But as a senior, my brother was running track, and I was going to be having to run in the Army, so I figured that I would join the track team. So it was my first year on track as a senior, and the coach loved to have me run with all the girls. And I thought it was great. I got to run with all the girls, and they were all the same speed as me, so it all worked out really well. But you kind of have this notion of the senior who's the leader, even though they were not the best at the particular skill that we were doing, but just somebody that would be responsible for us going. It also reminds me of one of my classmates at West Point, who was an awesome woman, Lori Ryder at the time. She would run with me because she thought I paced beautifully. And so we'd run the beginning of the 2 mile together. And then as soon as the finish line was there, I wouldn't see her anymore. She'd just run past me. But, at the time I was, something like 11:50 on the 2 mile. And by running with me, it got her right to where she needed to be to then take off. So it's kind of funny to think back of some of those things that you've done where you were leading, but not because you were the best at something, but because you could lead.
I love that, because I always tell people that leadership is all around us, and it's just waiting for us to grab onto it or to step into it. And it's not just this CEO or this senior officer. It's all of us and all the things that we do and how we build relationships and in how we essentially show people, shine a light back on people and show them what their talents and their strengths are, and to be the genius maker, like Liz Wiseman says. Instead of having to be the genius, you get to be the genius maker in a lot of different areas.
And in a lot of our technical specialties, the Army misses the boat in thinking that because someone is technically competent in a difficult area, that they don't want to lead. We've seen plenty of people, and even just going back, there's different people that want to lead, or that don't really appreciate leading, or don't want to they don't want to be the personnel lead. Maybe they'll be the technical lead, but there's these different ways of leading. So they keep thinking that the person they find that likes to both lead and do technically demanding things is defined as a unicorn, when I think those kinds of people can be a lot more prevalent than people want to give credit. And part of that is because there are so many different ways of leading. And if we go back to the infantry type mentality, they think that the only definition of leading is somebody that would want to lead a infantry battalion or a brigade. And I look back on my career, and I got to lead a infantry company. And I know that I would have liked to have led pretty much any organization that they were to give me. But there's no way that I would have ended up running the Army's think tank for cyber operations at West Point had I not gone on the route that I did. At some point in my career, I realized that what I had were some unique skills that that I could put to use in the Army doing something different than what some of my compatriots could do. I remember being down at Eisenhower Hall, which is our student union at West Point. And that's where we were meeting with the infantry branch rep. And I told the infantry branch rep I was interested in being the executive officer or a operations officer for a battalion. And they said, well, we kind of thought you were going to be an operations research analyst, which was kind of interesting because at the time I was an infantry officer and a systems automation officer. So I was what at the time we called a computer specialist. And the branch came up with yet another option of what they thought I was going to be, which I hadn't really thought of until I walked home in the snow and said, I really need to think about what I'm doing. But you find where you have a unique capability at times, and you look at what you can do versus what others can do. And we only have so much time on this earth. And so to be able to do things that you're uniquely qualified to do is a good way to spend your time.
Absolutely. And I also would like to call out not only when we worked together for the Army's think tank on cyber, but also even your experience prior to that when you were helping to actually set up the cyber branch. There's this huge aspect of leadership that is also championing projects and removing obstacles so that things can move forward. And I know that you had a huge role in that when it came to standing up an entire branch within the service, which is a really difficult thing to do.
You're exactly right. And I've got a placard up on my wall that says Colonel Hall, PRP Div Chief, AKA Cyber Daddy. It was not lost on the people in my division that what we were doing was ensuring that the cyber branch got stood up. And there were just so many little things that had to be done that couldn't be done outside the building. And we like to explain it for people that have never worked inside the kind of a bureaucracy that is the Army. When the Department of the Army is doing things, they happen within the Pentagon, within Washington, D.C. And no matter where you are in the rest of the world or how powerful you are in the rest of the world, you often have to have an advocate inside the Pentagon to get across the last, we would say, to punch it into the end zone, to get it into the red zone. At the time, I was very blessed to be working with Jen Buckner and with Greg Conti. And Greg was up at West Point working as the Army Cyber Institute. Jen was the commander of the 780th. We would be on the phone call, and I'd be on the phone call with Greg, and he'd say, I think we need to have cyber lieutenants. If you don't have a cyber lieutenant, you're starting behind, because if you've got 20 years in the Army and you don't let someone be cyber until they're a major, then there are 20 years in the Army and only 10 years in cyber. So we really need to have lieutenants. So we called up Jen, and Jen's like, I don't see it. And so, okay, think about it for a while. We'll get back to you. And so we kept cycling ideas through this group of three until we came up with what really were some great ideas. It was a lot of fun to get a chance to work with both of them, but I thought that I offered something unique in the sense that I was in the building. The other thing that is kind of interesting is that you have authority to do things. And when I was in the Pentagon, there were certain things that I, as the colonel in charge of the manpower and structure, that my signature made it so. So we had some ideas that we were working on that people said, you can't do this, it would take years. And we said, okay, well, what is it that you want? And we can do it in a week, because all I have to do is type it up and we'll be done. And when we came up with the idea of having a branch, was one of those things where I was called with General Siemens up to the front office. General Siemens at the time was the deputy G1, and the G1 was out. And the vice chief of staff of the Army, General Campbell, called us up to his office and wanted to know exactly what would it take to make a branch, because it was now our task. When you wanted to do something anyways, it was exciting, but when the vice chief of staff of the Army gives you the task, you're like, oh, this is awesome. Now I have complete top cover. We had quite a few times when we were doing things, and I was blessed to be working with General Siemens, who would listen to what you were thinking, and he'd have some great ideas. And one of his great ideas was that we needed to get people that had master's degrees. So that they were saying, okay, well, how much money will it cost to get somebody with a master's degree? And so we came up with the idea that instead, let's look at brand new ROTC graduates and West Point graduates and then send them directly to grad school. They already owe us. It won't cost us anything to get them to do it. Whereas if you were trying to convince somebody that already chosen that they didn't want to be in the Army, now you're trying to change someone's mind with money, that never works very well. But we had there was one lieutenant that had been a mathematician up in Alaska, at the University of Alaska, and they had no idea, at the point this person was going through advanced camp, the cyber branch was a PowerPoint deep slide. Hey, join us, right? And so when the person graduated and we're like, we'd like to send you to the Naval Postgraduate School to spend 1 year studying what this cyber business is all about, they were all in. You may or may not actually need people with a master's degree, but they thought they did. So we found a way to get it at the least possible cost, but at the same time, what we were doing was injecting in our human capital. And any investment in human capital was always going to be worthwhile. You had some interesting ideas that get thrown out when you're trying to do something new, and so you have to kind of find ways to make them work. It was a fascinating time to be, kind of in the gears of making it all work.
And I think when you were talking earlier about your style and building consensus, and then the cycling ideas between you and Greg Conti and Jen Buckner and all of that, it really makes me think that a lot of people talk about an agile work environment, and you don't immediately think of the Army per se, or a big structure like that. So to even have like that kind of mindset, I think really helps set it up, especially cyber, and then especially the Army Cyber Institute, in being more even open to operating in a different way.
It was one of the first places where some of those that were working for us would pitch an idea, and then we'd say, okay, go do it. And they're so used to having to fight for it. It's like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. Go do that. At times, as a leader, in an organization like that, I was very blessed to have people working around me that were willing to listen to what I was trying to do so that they would be able to do that as well. And then to be able to do the overhead cover that you need when you're working in an agile type environment to just get the roadblocks out of the way of the talented research scientists so they try to do what they needed. When they needed assets, we gave them assets.
And I think some people did absolutely thrive in that environment. From your perspective, what were some of the challenges that people who are not used to that and who didn't adapt to it as easily or as quickly or as well, what do you think some of their challenges were with adapting to that more open and agile work environment?
So it reminds me of when we were cadets at West Point. We had these chests, I guess, or wardrobes. And so the wardrobe was wood, and then it would carve in a bit to have little handles. And so if you can imagine that the little handles together have this little hole. And so Kevin Kiefer, my roommate, thought it'd be really fun to just, sit there with a ball and to throw the ball to try to get it through the little hole. So you're just sitting there for hours. And I think that sometimes, that is a procrastination technique because you're like, I don't exactly know what to do. And so I'm going to make this game that makes my life a little better. And we used to joke that we wanted to give everybody a little bit of rain, but we didn't want to see people sitting at their desks throwing pencils at the ceiling to see if they could get them to stick. We needed them to be able to go forward. So that there's a certain amount of having a team. And you need to have a team that's doing established work so you can put someone onto a team and have them start to realize, oh, I see how this could work. And then they can come up with some of their own ideas. Now, being that a lot of those that come to West Point are coming out of grad school, the grad school environment can be one where after 2 years of grad school, you're launching to start a PhD. Now, most people in a technical field are not going to do a PhD while they're at West Point, but their education was that would be the next thing that they would do. And so you found some people had these ideas which they wanted to start doing, which would have been the same thing they would have done as a PhD student, because they come into West Point, they've got 2 years, they just finished their master's. The PhD model is at that point you transition into teaching, and you're teaching and as a research assistant, and you're kind of learning more about academia before you actually finish your dissertation, which is why dissertations take 6, 7, 8 years sometimes for people to do, because there's this teaching element, and people put so much time and effort into that, and then you have to balance out the teaching and the research portion. What we found was that some of the people had a wonderful preparation and were ready and had ideas on what they wanted to do. And others were not ready to lead research. And so just like we talked about, leading people can be different, leading research can be different. And I've seen where you have people leads and technical leads, and they at times are working together. And then you also find that in an organization like the military, that has a rather rigid rank and caste structure, certain people are supposed to do the leading. You also find that sometimes the people that were a little bit younger had a little more fire to start, and they were at a different point in their career, whereas sometimes our lieutenant colonels were at the tail end of their career, and they were just as capable as the majors, and the majors were going to be really had some ideas on what they wanted to do. And so how do you balance that out and ensure that everybody's getting a chance to work together? I think that's a fascinating problem.
The fascinating part is that it's not that it's unsolvable, but it's that it's ever evolving. And just as things adapt and change, it is a super interesting challenge. One of the things that I also super appreciated when we worked together that I had never experienced with any individual that I worked with before was that you recognized very quickly that I tend to trend towards more of an introvert, which sometimes people wouldn't believe. But I remembered we were at, there was a team function, and you were very social and talking to people. And I just was like kind of standing over in the corner waiting for people to come to me. But I had really appreciated that you saw that side of me and made that very comfortable for me within that organization. And I think you did that for a lot of people. So from your experience, how is that personality management and that understanding of human behavior also play a role in creating that type of environment?
I had two wonderful deputies. The first one was an officer that I had served with before that had done research, and the two of us had done research back in the Information Technology Operations Center back when it was first standing up, and this ITOC organization would eventually become the ACI. So it was interesting. It was something that we were working on. We were working on Land Warrior, and Fernando and I were working together, and he had basically only committed to just kind of get the transition done, because as I was coming over, it was about time for him to go do something else. But he stayed on and really paid attention to what I was trying to do. But at the same time, we looked at what each of us could do. And there was a continuity role that he was going to fill. And there was going to be a different leadership role that was going to be a little more of, when we came in, I needed him to flip roles with what he had been doing. And so he had been doing the bureaucratic, how we make the organization run, and had not been working on research because the previous director was doing the research part. And so I was able to say to him, "You've got some ideas, right?" "Yes, I got some ideas." "Okay, let's do those ideas." And one of his ideas was the Jack Voltaic series, and the other one was threat casting. And granted, the threat casting one was a partnership with Brian David Johnson at ASU, and there were a lot of people within the ACI that ended up working on that project. And then there was a large group of people from all over New York City that ended up working with us on the Jack Voltaic product. And then we took that on and went to Houston and then South Carolina with that project. But it was one of those things where his role had been to bureaucratically or to do the running of the day-to-day. And I thought that in order for me to help the organization, I had to understand that as well as our mission. And so we kind of switched roles. I knew that when we were coming in to bring the second deputy, Chris Hartley, that what I was looking for somebody to do was to do the work that Fernando had done for Greg. And so when he was running things, and so I got somebody that was definitely a people person, 100% fully capable technically, so that they would be able to provide assistance, and also interested in everything that we were doing, so that he could listen and actually want to be listening. I don't want to say that people don't care, but you have to have an interest and a technical depth to be able to listen and really care about what the person's saying, and to be able to respond in the way that these young officers needed. Both of them were fabulous deputies, and they both worked to complement me and to complement the team. And we also had, the blessing of having a sergeant major role inside the ACI, and we had great opportunities to get that kind of synergy, as well as with Jeff Morris, who was the first ACI sergeant major, a unique bird. Not too many people that find their way to get PhD in quantum cryptography as a enlisted soldier, who broke so many rules that they didn't even know were rules. They didn't have regulations to prevent him from doing what he was doing, and that was it was really fun to get a chance to work with him, because he definitely one of a kind individual. And then of course we had you came in to backfill him with a very also wonderful personality, but different. And so as we come in, we had the relationship between the deputy and the sergeant major and the director was a very special relationship where the three of us were trying to get a role done. As you're going along, people come and go, and you've got the rest of the organization to run, but you see how much the unique roles of senior leaders can have an effect on the organization. And not everybody sees it the same way. And you can call people different things. Some of the roles can be done by a chief of staff, or there's a certain amount of kind of laissez-faire leadership that not everybody appreciates. Some people think of it as, wow, I'm not sure the director's doing anything, versus kind of this active, because it's the laissez-faire, type of idea. You're letting people do things, but it's not necessarily as hands-off as people would think. That kind of a leadership style still takes effort. It's not that nothing's for free.
Absolutely. And in that vein, it reminds me of, this is an older Harvard Business Review article that talked about beware of the busy manager, right? So the person who is always trying to look like they're out front and all this sort of stuff is working so hard at looking productive sometimes that they're not actually productive in any way. And I think that you highlighted really well there too, that it's acknowledging, as a leader, it's acknowledging what roles people can fill with their strengths and with their personality types, but being willing to not have hard, fast rules, right? Where the chief of staff does this and the deputy does this and it wasn't like that. So it was like really kind of letting it evolve the way that the organization needed, but then also in a way that kept those individuals very energized and very involved.
And another thing that not everybody has the chance to have, especially in today's world, is an executive assistant. And when you read the literature, the executive assistant is really designed to be an extension of the executive. And when you have somebody that is a fabulous person that is willing to listen and understands what the leader needs, they can take a lot off the plate. And with the military being very detailed oriented, if you're just kind of working in a kind of a laissez-faire attitude, there can be things that would get missed. And the great thing about having EA is at the end of the day, I could come back into the office after having wandered around and talked to people over the course of the day and have a laid out the things that had to get done before I went home. And these are the things that need to be signed. Here's the things that need to be done. There's one way that this happens often in the military, where at the end of the day, the lieutenants line up to talk to the commander about the things that have to get done at the end of the day. And then once the lieutenants all go home, then the captains go line up at the battalion commander to go try to get the things that have to get done. But with an executive assistant, you can kind of free those people up to go home. You don't need to stay here until the boss is ready to see you at the end of the day, because they're going to take a look at what needs to be done. If we don't have the answers we need, we'll worry about that tomorrow. So you've got this certain amount of trust that somebody has done the right work, and you don't make them hang out there to see it, but it also doesn't put the pressure on the senior leader to do all of the work while people are watching them. You can talk through things with an EA and try to figure out where we're going. The EA that we had, Elise, was phenomenal. And one of the things that she was really good at was that she had been a kindergarten teacher. And so she could treat people like adults or treat them like kindergartners. And it all depended on where you were, if you were acting like a kindergartner, she knew how to deal with that. And it was classic to see her work through some of the issues that we had with people, because you have some adults that sometimes act like they're kindergartners.
Yes, she is one of my favorite humans and always will be. She is amazing. So another big project that you and I had worked on while at the Army Cyber Institute was this idea of workplace layout and kind of the psychology of that. Why do you think that the actual physical layout of a workspace is so important to the type of team that you had?
I think that you need to combine the different activities that you have during a day and have spaces for those activities. I've worked in a variety of office spaces, and some are extremely collaborative and others are kind of walled off. One of the things that I saw working in the Joint Operations Division of the Joint Staff J3 was the way furniture could create an environment. So we had this one particular area where there were file cabinets, and the file cabinets were arranged such that they made a desk or a table. So it was like a stand-up desk, and that was one of the places where we would go when we needed to do activities together. A lot of times it was building binders, and you had a certain amount of joking around and kind of finding a way to build binders so that it would be a little faster. But at the same time, in our normal place, we had low cubicles, and you could stand up and holler at somebody, and we would often be tasked with doing worldwide staffing of a product within an hour. And so somebody was standing at a whiteboard and she would have all the names of all the people we needed. And you just stand up, see who hadn't been got yet, call them next. And you're working to try to see, does everybody agree with this thing that we're going to be giving to the secretary? And most people would never imagine that you would be trying to get worldwide staffing on a product in such a short amount of time. But there were more than one time when I worked on the joint staff that we needed everybody's opinion. And you really needed to be able to tell the secretary what everybody thought. And it was really important that the people on the other end of the phone, that you had a relationship. It was not the first time you were calling them, but that they knew what their commander was thinking. You had to be working future enough so you knew what kind of things were going to be coming up, but you also had to make sure that sometimes you could work at the speed of what needed to be done. When you're in a group where you're going to need to be doing a lot of work all together, that requires one type of space. And if you're going to be doing a lot of deep thinking by yourself, then maybe you need a full office. And at the same time, offices are not always designed to become collaborative spaces. And so if you have collaborative spaces that you can move to, then you can have kind of the best of both worlds. We got a chance to go to the Steelcase showroom, which is down in Manhattan, down in Financial District. You get a chance to see people that are serious about their business. They're serious about furniture, but they're serious about making areas work. Most of the world outside of the Army, if you're working and redoing an entire floor of a building, you have the flexibility to just, walls are not a problem. We'll just, you've got things that are load bearing, but you've got a lot of flexibility. And so they kind of showed you what could happen. It really brings in the idea of experts. And I think it goes on to this notion of teaming, is that how much do you need to work with somebody so you can push the I believe button? There's psychology that goes into this structure. They have determined that this is a really workable solution. How much do you have to know about the psychology to believe them? I think that as we go forward with more teaming, I was talking with a student about this today. How do you balance out having to go back and learn more prereqs? And we use the example of colors in data science. So you're going to use colors to represent your graphics. There are some colors that work really well for people that are colorblind. You could go back and study color theory and try to learn everything you need to know about color theory and understand the art that goes behind why these are good choices. Or you can kind of say, okay, I understand. Their experts have put together these colors that are a good choice, and I'm going to go with that. And so how much do you accept the advice of teammates or the way a team works together versus having to know everything yourself? In mathematics, we often call chapter 0 is everything you need to know to be able to read this particular text. And sometimes you'll develop things over time. But there's things like measure theory that if you're going to do probability at an advanced level, if you're going to study financial mathematics, you have to have an understanding of measure theory to be able to understand the concepts. And this is why financial mathematics is generally taught at the PhD level as opposed to at the undergraduate level, because how much you have to learn to be able to think about it can be a challenge. And there are some great textbooks that try to take a look at how do you make something that's hard accessible to undergraduates? And that can be really fascinating too. How do you structure something so that you do a little bit of the I believe button? I guess in many regards, this goes back to something that I did when I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, and I was working with the aerospace department on a particular software program. And so the aerospace students had the problem. They would give it to us, Fariba Fru and myself in the math department. We took their equations and we made a system of ordinary differential equations, which we would then feed into a nonlinear programming solver. We had an algorithm that would set and would get us a solution, and then we'd give it back to the aerospace students. We didn't know what we were doing. They didn't know what we were doing, but we were a team. It was compartmentalized in that they give us a problem and we throw them back a solution over the fence.
what advice would you offer any current leaders?
Wow, that's one of those tough ones. Some of the concepts that we've been throwing around lately when we think about transitioning, and we talk with veterans that are transitioning. That's one of the things that I've been working with a little bit. We have this notion that we had from our early days as officers of know yourself and seek self-improvement. I really think that it's worth taking the time to spend time knowing who you personally are. One of the things that a friend of mine, Matt Lewis, wrote a book called Mission Transition, which is about how you transition from being in active duty to being retired, or in reserves to being retired, or how do you transition? And I think that although it's designed for veterans, I think it's got a lot of great concepts about transitioning. But one of the things or an error that people make when transitioning is they focus on the job as opposed to who they are. And so they don't really know anything about the civilian sector. And so they're really not going to be able to identify jobs until they understand who they are. And then when you understand exactly who you are and what it is that's going to make you successful, then you can kind of go forward. So I would say that when you're working as a leader, you need to encourage the people that work for you to help you understand who they are and what's going to make them tick. And you spend time investing in your people. I love Dilbert. There's so many great concepts that come out of humor, but you have to set yourself up in a situation where you're willing to listen, and you have to spend enough time to understand your own strengths and weaknesses. And then you either have to acknowledge your weaknesses or work to fix them. And sometimes it may be something that you really can't fix, and it's maybe not a fix, maybe it's just a strength versus a weakness, but it's part of who you are. And then that's what you need to look for in your teammates, so that you have teammates that complement one another. I think that the notion of hiring a person for a job that's been spec'd out is yesterday. I think that you have to hire teams. It doesn't matter what the person had that left. You need to look at who the current team is to determine what kind of a person or multiple people would complement the team that you have right now.
I love all of that. And especially when it's that, like, just that concept of know thyself, because I think sometimes leaders, we become leaders and it becomes so much about everybody else that we forget about ourselves and our part in that equation in some ways. But that combined with that point you just made about how one person in one role, like the average job role changes within 6 months anyway. So really, does this person fit in a way that does complement and challenges other people on the team?
Which is one of the large challenges that we have in the government right now. Because in the government, a person has a program description, a PD written, and that's what they're supposed to do. And you're not allowed to make them do something that is different than what you hired them to do. That is tying government to yesterday, and it is one of the greatest challenges that we have. We have to find a way to be able to evolve as work evolves.
Okay, my last question for you is, do you have a resource or a book that you recommend to others?
I like to read. So to have a book that you'd recommend to others, that's really hard. What I would throw out to you is two things. First, the Cybersecurity Canon Project, which if you're in the cybersecurity field is a project right now hosted by The Ohio State University, where the goal is to review books to let people know what is really good and state of art within our field. If I get two others, you should read Neuromancer by William Gibson and Cryptonomicon by Neil Stevenson. Neither one of those you will regret spending your time.
I love that. Thank you so much. This has been so amazing. I always love chatting with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Equipping Leaders podcast. For more leadership development content, you can visit my website, natashacheyenne.com, where you will find my leadership journal with dozens of articles and the Cultivation Cafe, which is always growing and has leadership frameworks, book recommendations, and inclusion and mental health resources. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha or at Equipping Leaders Podcast and on Twitter at Natasha Cheyenne. Join me next week for another episode.